So, number 8, how can anyone take on our guilt? This is a correlate question, the one we just said. We just entered the question of why is it God had to come to earth? Why is it God, as it said, had to humble himself and die? And the reason is because of atonement. We need to be atoned from that sin. So how can one man's sin atone for all of us? And the reason the Muslims are asking this is because of 2 verses in the Quran. In chapter 6, verse 164, and in chapter 53, verse 38, it's very clear that no man can take on the sin of another, that you cannot take on my sin, I cannot take on your sin, I can't even take on my own sin. Why? Because everybody's sin, well, I can take on my own sin according to Islam, but according to Christianity, I can't. But according to Islam, everybody is responsible for their own sin. So therefore, Adam and Eve's sin was their own sin. They're responsible for that sin. We cannot be imputed with their sin. And that's why these 2 verses are in the Quran. Chapter 6, verse 164, chapter 53, verse 38, is to hold Muslims accountable and say, no, you're not imputed with Adam and Eve's sin. And Muslims come to me all the time, and they say, how can we be imputed with Adam and Eve's sin? That is their own sin. They have to take care of their own sin. We, each of us, have to take care of our own sin. That's why we have angels who sit on this shoulder and other angels who sit on this shoulder. These angels are recording our good deeds to placate from our bad deeds, which are recorded on this shoulder. It's like a bank account. Credits on this side, debits on this side. Credits and debits, credits and debits. And hopefully you have more credits when you die than you have debits. That's how they take care of their own sin. We cannot be imputed with Adam and Eve's sin. That's their sin. Therefore, Jesus cannot take on our sins. Because Jesus, a mere man, cannot take on my sin. I am responsible for my own sin. You'll hear Muslims say this all the time. How can someone be responsible for my guilt? What I love to do is I love to go right back to the Quran. And I love to go back to the Garden of Eden in chapter 2, in chapter 7, and in chapter 20 of the Quran. But go to chapter 7 and tell them this. Say, if you don't believe in imputed sin, then I want you to tell me what's happening in chapter 7 of your Quran. Because in your Quran, the Garden of Eden is up in space. It's not on earth. It's up in the sky. Adam and Eve are in that garden. They sin by eating of the fruit. It's very similar to the story we have in Genesis. God then condemns them for their sin. Then he forgives them for their sin. And then he sends them down to earth. He throws them down to earth, according to verse 24. And they come to Mecca, and Adam comes to Chennai, Sherman there in Kerala, in your country. So this is according to the traditions, how it happened. But there in verse 24, he throws them out of Garden of Eden down to earth. So ask your Muslim friends this, all right? Are you up in that garden right now? And the answer is no. None of us are in the Garden of Eden. Now, maybe in Mumbai, or maybe in Kerala, or maybe wherever you are listening to me right now, maybe where you are is maybe be the Garden of Eden for you, but it is not the Garden of Eden that we see in the Bible, and it's not the Garden of Eden that we see in the Quran. Every one of us, human, is on earth. We're not up in space. So tell your Muslim friend, okay, so you're here on earth, then aren't you being imputed with Adam and Eve's sin? The fact that none of you are up in space, the fact that none of you in that garden, the fact that none of you have ever been in that garden shows me that even in the Quran, you're imputed with Adam and Eve's sin. So how do you answer that? And in 40 years of asking Muslims that question, I have yet to see a Muslim that's ever considered that. They had no idea that the whole problem of guilt is also endemic in the Quran. Because every human is on earth. Not one of them is up in the Garden of Eden. So they'll say, oh, no, because we're not up there because we're being tested. I say, so you're being tested like Adam and Eve were tested. Why aren't you being tested in the Garden of Eden like they were tested in the Garden of Eden? So just keep on stepping it back. The Quran is absolutely imbued with what we call the fall of man. The fall of man is also there in the Quran. So then go to the next step and say, well, then how are you going to get back up in that garden? The fact that you are also imputed with Adam and Eve's sin, then what are you going to do with chapter 6, verse 164? What are you going to do with chapter 53, verse 38? Because that's an internal contradiction. And what you've done is you use the Quran against them. And that's a real problem. And then say you don't have any idea how to get back up into that garden. But in fact, you want to know how to get home again. There's no way you can do it through the Quran. Come on back to the Bible. Come on back to the Bible. But then also, you've got to say that the reason that we don't have about guilt, let's just look at that man on that cross. Ask the next question. What about that man on the cross? In chapter 4, verse 157, it says that another man took his image, that God took the image of Jesus, put it on this other man, and that man died. Jesus didn't die. That man died in his place. Now, isn't that a contradiction? Because that contradicts chapter 6, verse 164. That contradicts chapter 53, verse 38, because that man on the cross was taking on the guilt of Jesus. So there's another internal contradiction. Deal with it. Thank God we don't have that problem. And that's why you can just throw these questions right back in their laps. But more than that, say, what about that man on the cross? If he wasn't Jesus, what was he doing there then? And how does that absolve you from your guilt? Because it cannot just be a man on the cross that dies. It has to be God himself. It has to be he who was sinned against. It has to be he who was sinless. And there's only one person that's sinless, as we've said over and over again today, and his name is Jesus Christ.